So with this conversation, we are going to pick up where we left off in the bone chapter, or the bone packet. So you will be working off of the same bone packet that we had in class last time we met face to face. We had gotten through just over half of the packet, kind of introducing the skeleton as a whole, understanding that the number of bones you have in the skeleton is going to change as you grow and develop. So starting out around 300 bones when you are first born. And then as you grow and develop, some of those bones are going to start to fuse together. And that's why we see that number drop from 300 down to 206 by the time that you reach adulthood, is just the fusing of those individual bones. Best example is probably in the skull, where you start out with those bones being separate from each other. And as you go through progression of developing on into your teen and early 20s, teen years and early 20s, those bones will eventually completely fuse together. And so that's why we see the decrease in number over time. Understanding that you have two main divisions to your skeleton, the appendicular and the axial skeleton. The appendicular is going to involve your appendages, so your arms and your legs, and holds a majority of the bones at 126. And the reason that it is more than the axial skeleton is because with the hands and the feet being in the appendicular part of the skeleton, they have so many small bones that we see a total of 126 in the appendicular skeleton, with only 80 of the bones in the axial skeleton. The axial skeleton is going to be determined by those bones that are right on the core line of the body, or the center of the body. So the skull, the vertebrae, the rib cage, those are going to make up your axial bones, or your axial skeleton. We also talked about the different classifications of bones and what sets those apart. As we work into our next class, you guys will get to see some of the bone models, and we can talk about that a little bit more, why you have, or what makes a long bone, a flat bone, a regular, and all of those. And then we capped off our conversation last time talking about the long bone. And I want to be specific again that when you talk about the parts of a long bone, when you get into different classifications of bones, they have the same parts. So they're also going to have red marrow and yellow marrow. They will have some of the same structures that are present, compact bone, spongy bone, as the long bone does, but they change a little bit. So again, when we talked about the design of a long bone, that is very specific to those bones like the femur and the tibia or the humerus, but just to that particular classification. If you were to look at a flat bone or an irregular, the location of those things would be much different. So today we're going to pick up with the microscopic structures and taking a look at the cells that we have present within our bones. And there's a wide variety of cells that you guys have within your bones, because there's a lot of different jobs and tasks that need to be carried out within your bone structure. We are going to focus mainly on those that are going to fall into kind of the structure part of the bones. And so when you look at that slide, microscopic structure, right now it really only has one bone type that is identified on it. I want you to add three others onto that particular sheet or that slide. So it has osteocytes that is identified for you. I want you to also add in osteoblasts. So osteoblast, osteoblast. Osteoclast, osteoclast, and then bone lining cells. Again, even in expanding that to 4 different types of cells, we are really just touching the tip of the iceberg as to the different types of cells that we have within our bone structure. So I'm actually going to take a step back, and we're going to start talking about the osteoblasts. Osteoblasts are going to be the baby cells of your bone structure. So these are the ones that are newly produced. In your long bone, we talked about the growth plates that you guys have at either end of the bone, at the proximal and the distal epiphysis. And it's at that growth plates that these new osteoblasts would come into being within the bone structure itself. That's where they're produced, is at those growth plates. Now, I use the term baby, and the reason that I talk about that is because osteoblasts are immature cells. They are not fully developed, they are not mature, and also because it's an easy way to remember what they are. B, blast, and baby match each other, so it's just kind of an easy thing that you can use if that's your thing for memorizing or learning information. They both have the letter B in them. So osteoblasts are the new cells that are produced, and they are going to develop over time and eventually turn into or transition into mature bone cells. But at their early formation within the bone structure, they're still immature. They're not fully ready to go. They are actually going to originate from the stem cells that you guys have within your bone structure. And we talked within our first couple of weeks about stem cells. Stem cells are cells that don't have any programmed information. They have not yet been determined as to what they're specifically going to be within the body. So a stem cell can be programmed to be anything, and these stem cells are going to give directions to this particular group of osteoblasts that they are going to turn into bone cells within their lifetime. So osteoblasts, these are the new cells. They are going to transition and become actual bone cells, which takes us to our osteocytes. So that prefix osteo, you see it in 3 out of the 4 names of the bone cells that we're going to talk about. Osteo does indicate bone, and the suffix cyte, wherever you see cyte attached, that is always going to mean cell. So osteo means bone and cyte means cell. So if you break down this name, it means bone cell. Blast, anytime that you see that attached to a particular type of cell, doesn't matter if it's a bone cell, a blood cell, a muscle cell, if it has blast attached to it, you know that that is the immature form of that particular cell type. So within the osteocytes, once those osteoblasts reach full maturity and they have grown and developed, now they are going to be osteocytes. And osteocytes, being the adult cells, this is going to be the group of cells that is really going to give the strength and the structure to the bone as a whole. These cells you would find tucked into little locations called lacunae. We haven't got there yet. That's a little bit later in our conversation. But they have their own individual kind of matrix that they live in, and each cell gets tucked into one of those spaces or one of those lacunae. So osteoblasts are the baby, osteocytes are the mature bone cells. We also have bone lining cells. Now, bone lining cells are actually going to be found on the surface of the cell, and they have a little bit different structure than what the other bone cells do. So again, when we think of cells, we think of these nice round shaped objects, and with our bone cells or our bone lining cells, they're actually flat, and they extend out and flatten themselves out so that they can cover the surface of the bone. And even with everything that we know about bone cells right now, a lot of what these bone lining cells do is completely misunderstood. They are still doing a lot of research trying to figure out what they do. One of the leading theories out there is that they play a role in creating a barrier between the bone structure itself and the last group of cells that we haven't talked about quite yet. So just know that the location of your bone lining cells is over the surface of the cell. The shape of the cell is going to be nice and flat that allows them to extend out and cover more area than if they were rounded and more bubble shape or round shape like we think of our cells being. And the other thing is these particular groups of cells have very few organelles. So if you think back to our organelle talk, we talked about mitochondria and ribosomes and Golgi apparatus and endoplasmic reticulum and all of those structures that you have within a cell. The bone lining cells really have very few of these organelle structures inside of them. And that also is kind of a mystery as to why they have fewer than what the surrounding cells around them do. Now, part of their job, like I said, is believed to be linked to the final cell type that we have, the osteoclast. Now the osteoclast is, again, we see that osteo prefix indicating bone, and clast is a particular type of cell that is going to do destruction. So within the osteoclast, they have a digestive enzyme, and when they release that digestive enzyme, it is going to spread out and cover the surrounding cells, and the enzyme will actually eat away at the bone tissue and digest it and break it down. Now, initially that sounds like a bad thing, but where it's used is in places where the bone needs to be reformed or remodeled, or if the bone has been broken and you have sharp, jagged edges. The bone can't repair itself with those sharp edges, and so the osteoclast will go into the site of the bone break and release that digestive enzyme and help smooth off those jagged pieces or parts of the bone so that the healing process can begin. So there's some very good reasons that we need to have these osteoclasts within our bone structure so that the health of the bone can be maintained, and in times of injury that the bone can be restructured the way that it needs to be. Now, going back to the bone lining cells, the surface of the cell, like I said, it's a theory. It has not been proven yet, but they believe that these bone lining cells over the surface of the cell are there in part to make sure that osteoclasts are not able to reach certain parts of the cell and break down, certain parts of the bone and digest or deteriorate that particular part or section of the bone. So still unknown. They are looking into it and trying to figure out all the time. It's amazing with all the technology that we have, how many things are still a mystery within the body. They don't fully understand some of the organelles. They don't fully understand some stem cells and how they work. And so this is just another example of something that we have in the body doing its job, but we don't know 100% sure what it's doing for the body. So if you go to the next slide, it talks about the compact bone. I wanted to keep this part of the conversation separate from the long bone just because the parts of the long bone are a lot of information, and for some people, the first time they're getting introduced to that. And likewise, when we talk about the compact bone, for some, it's the first time that they're hearing this as well. So I do like to keep those two conversations separate just to reduce the amount of new terminology that you're kind of getting thrown at you in one setting. So today we are going to cover the compact bone. And if you're looking at the slide, what they've done is they've taken the bone. So if you look at the picture that's in the middle of that slide, you can see the bottom half of the long bone. They've cut it off, and so you just can see the bottom half. Then they've also done a cross section so that you can see into the core of the bone as well. From there, if you look at the top, you'll notice that there is an arrow, and they've taken kind of like a pie slice cut of the bone, and you'll see that arrow then pointing over, and they have magnified what that pie section would look like. And then they've gone one step further if you look at the circle at the bottom of that slide. So they've taken a circular cut and then magnified that so you could see what that looks like. So we're just looking at the same bone, but going a little bit more in depth, looking at different sections and magnifying them so that you can see them a little bit better. One of the first things that you need to understand about your bone is that when we think of bones, we think of them as being very, very strong, and that's true. But it's not just by chance, and it's not just because we take these bone cells and pack them all together in compact bone, and they are so tightly packed together that that's where the strength comes from. The strength within our bones actually comes from the arrangement of circular patterns known as osteons. So if you look at the very first term in that list, it refers to an osteon, and if you find it over in the picture, you'll notice that there is kind of a bar that extends across, and they've actually lifted one of the osteons out so that you can see it isolated from the rest of the bone tissue. Now, what happens is the osteon is going to be a collection of rings. Best example that I can give you if you are more of a visual type learner is if you think of a target. You have the bullseye at the middle, and then you have the rings that move out from that bullseye, and they all work together to form the target as a whole. That's essentially what an osteon is. You have a central core with rings around it, and when they all come together, they form that osteon. But in the case of our bone structure, we now will take osteons and put them right next to each other. So they are all packed together. And by having those osteons packed next to each other, that is where they are going to get their strength from. That is compounded by the circular shape as well. One of the strongest shapes that we have is, in fact, a dome or a rounded structure. And so when you look at the shape of the osteon, you can see that circular or that dome shape. And so again, that is where part of the strength is going to come from. So the design of the bone is very specific to the job that it has to do. And just having all of those rings packed together allows for that strength to be increased more than what it could be on its own. So the osteon is, like I said, those, if you just took one of those ring sections, that is the osteon. Then you have the central canal. At the core of every osteon, and I made reference to the bullseye, so kind of think of the bullseye. That is what the central core or central canal is. It would be the equivalent of the bullseye. This is going to be where your nerves run through. This is going to be where your blood vessels, so you would have both arteries and veins running through that central canal. And again, these cells are living. They have to have an oxygen supply. They have to have a nutrient supply. And so those blood vessels being able to get into the actual core of the bone itself is very important to make sure that those cells get everything that they need and all the nourishment that they need. Now, the next one that you have on the list is called the perforating canals, also known as Volkmann's canals. And these are going to also be openings or passages that you have through the bone structure, but they are going to run in a different direction. So your central canals run vertically. They run up and down through the osteons, but the perforating or the Volkmann's canal, they are going to run horizontally. And so they will actually link two different central canals. So you have an osteon on the left, you have the one on the right next to it, and then you will have you'll have a Volkmann's canal or a perforating canal that will connect the two. So again, just making that transport system of the blood vessels and the blood and allowing it to get to all of the cells within your bone structure. Now, if you look at the picture that you have there, you can find a central canal. So outside of that osteon, they also have some on the side of that bone structure as well. And then you can see the perforating canal, and you can see how it connects the two central canals that you have working there. So good visual in that picture. If you look in your textbook, you will also have that same image in color. The color just benefits you because the blood vessels are going to be in color, as well as the nerve structure, so you can set those apart a little bit easier. From there, we have the osteocytes. And again, we just got done talking about the osteocytes. Those are going to be the mature bone cells that you guys have within the bone structure. And then we get into some terminology that is fairly new for most people, looking at the lamellae, the lacunae, the bone matrix, and the caniculi. So within the bone structure, and I touched on this briefly when we went through our histology chapter, connective tissue is the most abundant type of tissue that we have in the human body. It's a wide range of cell types that you have because we have tendons and ligaments, cartilage that make up the connective tissue, which are thought of being very strong structural material. And then we go all the way to adipose tissue, which is fat, and to blood, which is almost liquid form. And so you have just this wide range of material within your connective tissue. So when we talk about connective tissue, the reason that we can get such a wide range of types, cell types, is because one of the features or characteristics that connective tissue has to have is that the cells are part of what is known as a matrix. So a matrix is going to be a way to have the cells not come in direct contact with each other. And so if you look at this, and specifically within that circle that's been pulled out and kind of blown up, You'll notice that it references the bone matrix that you have there. The way that the bone is created, you have all of these individual little pockets within the bone structure. And so within one of those pockets, you would plug in an osteocyte. So if you look at that picture and you can see all the lines crisscrossing and going each and every direction, and you see those individual little sections, each one of those is going to house one single bone cell. That is it. So because the cells are kept separated from each other and they don't come in direct contact, that is considered to be a matrix. And that is going to be one of the things that is going to put it into that connective tissue category. So when we look at the individual little pockets, those are called the lacunae. So each individual space that is created in the bone matrix, that is going to be a lacunae. Again, if you like references that are a little bit closer to home, kind of if you've ever played tic-tac-toe, you draw the tic-tac-toe board, you have the 9 spaces, and you can only plug in an X or an O into each one of those 9 spaces. You can't double up and put more than one in there. And that's the same exact thing with the bone matrix. So the tic-tac-toe board, that's the matrix. Each of the 9 spaces that you have within the tic-tac-toe board would be a lacunae. And then either the X or the O that you plug into each one of those spaces, that would be the osteocyte. And so, like I said, just maybe something that hits a little bit closer to home. The last one, and I know I skipped over lamellae, I'm going to come back to that one, but the last one that I want to talk about with this section is the caniculi. So even though the bone cells are separated from each other, they still need to have a way to communicate. A lot of not just our bone cell health, but our cell health overall is the ability to communicate. When conditions change within the body, a cell's ability to adapt and potentially protect itself from a foreign invader or something else that's in the body, whether a chemical is leached into the system, whatever it might be, the cells can actually communicate with each other, and that is a very important part of them maintaining their health. Those caniculi are going to be channels in which the cells, even though they're separated, can still send chemical messages to each other. And so the caniculi are just little paths or spaces for chemicals to be sent from one cell to the next. So it's just basically a message system, these little channels that cut through the bone matrix, allowing the bone cells to still be able to communicate with one another. Now with the lamellae, I'm going to go back to that, and the reason is because lacunae and the bone matrix, the caniculi, osteocytes, they all go together. The lamellae actually goes back to the osteon. So if we go back to the target matrix, you have the bullseye, that's the central canal, and then you have several rings that build the rest of the target. If you were to pull out just one ring, just one of them, that would be a lamellae. When you put all of the individual rings together, that is the osteon. So covering all of the terminology that you have within the bone structure. And like I said, I know for some people that will be a lot of new information and a lot of new terminology. So I wanted to be able to focus just on that. The last slide that you guys have talks about some of the things that will impact your bone growth and development. Because the bone or the skeleton grows over several years and even into your 20s, bone is still not fully developed. And then even as you go on past your early to mid 20s and you continue to age, your bones are transitioning. They are changing, adapting, remodeling. And there will be a point where bone health does unfortunately start to drop off. So getting the right vitamins and nutrition in your body, not just within those first few years, but all the way through your life, is going to play a huge role in your overall bone health. And sometimes people don't understand that necessity for having a well-balanced diet all throughout your lifetime. When we talk about our digestive chapter, it's something that I always bring up. What you are putting into your body right now is determining your health 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, 30 years down the road. And if you're giving yourself the proper nutrition now, when you get to that point and you're in your 50s, 60s, and 70s, you are going to reap the benefits then, because your body is going to have the stability and all of the good things that it needed now to ensure your good health later on. So vitamin A is something that is important to your bone health. If you don't have enough vitamin A in your diet, then it will potentially stunt your bone development or hold it back from what it could potentially be. Deficiency of vitamin C, if you don't have enough citrus fruits or just that access to vitamin C early on in your diet, then you're looking at having fragile bones, and then it being much easier to break bones. A typical fall that most people would get up from could potentially do damage to bones if that vitamin C is not where it needs to be. Vitamin D, we've been talking about vitamin D, got into that conversation a little bit with the integumentary system, and it's important in serotonin levels and things of that nature. But vitamin D also plays a huge role in bone development just because it helps with calcium absorption. Your body is better able to absorb calcium if you have good levels of vitamin D. And so those two things go together. So here it talks about developing something like rickets. Rickets is a situation where the bones will kind of bow and have the appearance of somebody that's been riding on a saddle for too long. The bones just kind of bow out and they're not straight as they should be. The next two that you have deal with growth hormone. The first one is insufficient. So if you don't have enough growth hormone in your body, that could result in dwarfism, somebody having a reduced stature. And then if you have too much growth hormone in your body, that could do just the opposite. And then that's a situation where you could potentially go above normal stature. And there's a variety of things that could play into that. Typically, the pituitary gland is going to be involved in that. Something is not regulating in the pituitary gland because that's where your growth hormone is going to stem from. The next one talks about your thyroid hormone. Thyroid is located in the throat area. And again, because it plays a part in metabolism, it also can affect your bone development as well. So if you don't have enough thyroid hormone, it will actually hold back or delay your overall bone growth. The next one, the sex hormones, they do actually play a role in your bone formation, specifically in the cases of the ossification of the epiphyseal plates. Now, when I talked about the epiphyseal plates, I call them growth plates because that is what people are more familiar with. So epiphyseal plates are just another way to refer to those growth plates where those new bone cells are going to be coming in. And then the last one, physical stress. Physical stress can actually stimulate bone growth. And that's because with physical stress, you have other hormones that are going to be dumped into the body at higher levels, and that can trigger the stimulation of bone growth within the body. So that is going to wrap up the conversation for this week. The video will be posted in Blackboard as well as your assignment. So please check for your assignment.